Hello, welcome to the lesson on development, globalization and society. Today's module is going to talk about globalization and its impact on labor. Let's try and understand that how globalization as a process affects the labor. But first, before we go on to understand the relationship between globalization and labor, it is important to understand what do we mean by the term globalization. Globalization is the process by which an increasing share of world production is traded internationally and the productive system of different countries become increasingly integrated. Such integration with world market bears the promise of prosperity for developing and in-transition economies. The process of globalization leads to integration of national economies while bringing about significant changes in market, products and financial, assisted by their common liberalization and deregulatory norms. But due to such integration, liberalization makes direct effect on labor in international market, irrespective of whether they are skilled, unskilled or semi-skilled. The neo-capitalism model with the outgrowth of globalization created a new mode of regulation. The concept of welfare state among the advanced industrial societies in the post-World War II period. Neo-colonialism and globalization of commerce is bringing a multitude of technologies and large-scale industrial projects to less developed nations. This globalization of labor has contributed to rising labor compensation in advanced economies by boosting productivity and output, while emerging market countries also benefited from the rising wages. Nevertheless, globalization is also one of the factors that have acted to reduce the share of income occurring to labor in advanced economies. Multinational corporations are the lead actor in this wave of technological change around the world, developing and operating new facilities and installation in host countries and partnering in various types of business venture with host country companies and agencies. Actually, host countries themselves welcome MNC activities for the jobs and other economic and societal benefit they provide. But MNCs, mostly freewheeling and profit maximizing, have often been accused of being excessively exploitive and harmful, posing risks to health, safety, and natural resources, and most importantly, endangering the workers involved. It is pointed out that these less developed countries hosting these activities are vulnerable to the exploitation of their human resources because they lack safeguards, expertise, and public pressure that prevent harm to workers in developed countries. Over the past 2 decades, labor markets around the world have become increasingly integrated. Political changes and economic reform have transformed China, India, and the former Eastern Bloc countries, effectively involving their large labor force in open market economies. At the same time, the development of technology combined with the progressive removal of restriction on cross-border trade and capital flows has made it possible for production processes to be located further from the target market from a growing universe of goods and services. The location of production has become much more responsive to relative labor costs across country. There have also been increasing flows of migrants across border through both legal and informal routes. In fact, industrialization of developing country is often accompanied by a rapid increase in the number of fatal and non-fatal accident rates due to the growth of new factories, the development of infrastructure, and the construction of new buildings and roads, all of which may employ untrained and migrant workers in new environment exposed to risk hitherto unknown to them. In addition to creating workplace hazards, activities by industry and their business affiliate in the developing country often involve exploitation of children, women, and migrant workers, often depriving them from their rights, especially in the case of rural poor. Apart from these immediate consequences, there are secondary effects emerging over a long term too. These include such phenomena as mass migration of the rural poor to industrial locales which are not prepared to provide housing, water, health services, education, and other necessity. Another long-term consequence is that such migration and demographic change disrupts indigenous activity such as rural agriculture and crafts and erodes the village and family system which have been essential features of the socio-economic fabric of host countries. For labor, globalization raises a number of key questions, and these are: what are its effects on wages, job security, conditions, and patterns of work? Secondly, has it created a new set of problems for labor, such as the cheap import of workers, de-skilling, and patterns of control and subordination. How have national economies attempted to regulate these effects and how successful have they been? Alternatively, is the state unable to influence the direction and effect of globalization? What type of strategies have trade unions adopted to protect members against the impact of globalization? At what level do workers need to act, and is it possible for unions to develop transnational perspective and structure? How can workers be mobilized, and how can workers' solidarity be achieved across firms, sector economies and cultures? Globalization can affect the labor market in a positive manner. Following the elevation of a price distortion with respect to both labor and capital, there may be increased capacity of developing country to create new opportunities for work and production. FDI has both direct and indirect effect on employment creation in the recipient country. There may also be spillover effect of TNC on local science, technology, education and training. Now let's understand what are the negative impact of globalization on labor. Large-scale technological development that accompany this phenomena reduce the demand on unskilled labor. Globalization can cause an increase in hidden unemployment, a lack of new job opening, and a deterioration of real wage rates in developing economy which are unable to adapt the new technologies. Most trade liberalization benefit will be received by the manufacturing producing country, while the smallest share will be going to the agricultural producing country or developing countries. Policies of structural adjustment, such as privatization, imply an increase in unemployment since privatization is accompanied usually by a reduction in the demand for labor. Some researchers and scholars believe that organizations could benefit labor by increased internationalism. However, in reality, globalization has been often raised rivalry between labor movement at both national and industrial level, so reinforcing a global division of labor. It is also argued that globalization, with its accompanying privatization and deregulation, has severely eroded the viability of the labor movement all over the world. For instance, due to globalization, in Indonesia, mobile capital demands favorable investment and climate, thereby increasing pressure on states to restrict organized labor. International Labour Organization was created in the aftermath of World War I, is now one of the largest specialized agencies of the UN. Its principal purpose is to establish minimum labor standard and to take the terms and conditions of employment out of global competition through the adoption of conventions and recommendations. Since its creation in 1990, ILO has adopted 185 conventions and 193 recommendations as well as many technical advisory standards, all of which related to workers' rights and employment policy, and some of which address hazards to workers' health and safety. ILO's 1998 Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work was unanimously adopted by all 176 member nations in a manner which does not require ratification for a follow-through. Nations are obligated to establish the right to collective bargaining and to abolish forced labor, child labor, and discrimination in employment, and have agreed to provide progress report for peer review and ILO publicity and be targeted for technical assistance as necessary. ILO has modified the soft law approach that it has created 4 norms for labor and employment accepted by all its nations, which will presumably be incorporated by reference in public law as well as in contract and other features of private law in all nations. However, the declaration does not include any right to occupational safety and health or any element of a regulatory program with workplace standard or other specific features. Nevertheless, ILO has created important ongoing program which addresses workplace health and safety in host country. With regard to big industry, ILO has developed guidelines on occupational safety and health management systems, which recommend how companies should organize and allocate management function to prevent, document, control, audit, and respond to workplace hazard, manage change, and also strive for continuous improvement. The manual outline for the management system are the generic management function. However, it does not provide any specific methods for worker protection, substantive standard and technical limits on worker exposure to physical and chemical hazards, safeguard for using machinery or other hazardous product, or any measure to prevent physical stress. The United Nations has been focusing mainly on environmental and sustainable development among industrial countries. Like ILO, it has developed numerous reports and recommendations for voluntary adoption by member nations through legislative action, judicial decision, or incorporated by references in treaties. The UN Center for Transnational Cooperation strongly tried to develop a framework for governing industrial activities, showing reports on industrial process safety and hazard, the role of transnational cooperation in world development, and hazardous product. However, opposition to UNCTC itself by industry and lack of support for its support from developing nations combined to cause the demise of this program. Other units such as the UN Conference on Trade and Development, the UN Industrial Development Organization, the World Health Organization, and the International Atomic Energy Agency have also developed norms and recommendations for voluntary adoption by host country. A major UN undertaking entitled Norms on the Responsibilities of Transnational Corporation and Other Business Enterprise with Regard to Human Rights, which have been negotiated over many years, failed to gain requisite support from large number of nations. Its proponent had sought to establish an international, legally enforceable system for industrial governance. Among its norms, Section 7 on the rights of the worker was a prominent substantive feature. It would have provided that host countries establish an affirmative duty for corporation to provide a safe and healthy environment for workers pursuant to previously enacted convention and other international instruments containing basic norms for worker protection. For instance, industry disclose information about the health and safety standard relevant to their local activity and permit workers to refuse unsafe work. Unfortunately, this initiative was abandoned for a lack of support in 2005. OECD and Corporate Code of Conduct. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development have enacted guidelines for multinational enterprises consisting of non-binding recommendation to industry operating in host countries or from OECD's 33 member nation in order to improve the international investment climate and to strengthen the basis of mutual confidence between multinational enterprises and the societies in which they operate. OECD commentary on the guidelines further provides that MNCs are expected to follow prevailing regulatory standard and industry norm to minimize the risk of accident and injury to health in the course of employment in order to raise the level of performance with respect to occupational safety and health in all parts of their operation, even where this may not be formally required by existing regulation in countries in which they operate. However, these norms are non-binding and OECD fails to provide a system for monitoring or enforcing their implementation. Nevertheless, OECD breaks new ground by calling for industrial performance to exceed host country requirement and rise at least to the level of an MNC's best practices anywhere, which can be assumed to be in the MNC's home country or another developed nation. Each national level association is responsible for enforcing compliance by its member companies. Firms must submit annual report to their association on progress toward full compliance and be subjected to a verification process, with the association then obligated to punish firms which fail to show progress by expelling them from its membership. The sanction of expulsion, which had been applied to several firms in the United States, for example, is significant because it is detrimental to a firm's reputation and business prospect. Widely recognized as an enlightened and privately enforced approach to public concern about industrial hazard, responsible care has been emulated in other business sectors. Many measures are adopted by international organizations for the welfare of laborers, especially to provide them basic health facility and minimal wages and overall development. But following up with this law and other such recommendation by the big company and industry is negligible. Each implementation of standard law is in bad condition due to a lack of proper check and balances available to them. For example, in India, Constitution provides for a directive principle which states that equal pay for equal work and also health facilities are to be provided to the laborers. But such code of conduct gets followed to an extent by organized sector only. But what about the unorganized sector, where most of the workers are working without proper facility? For example, brick manufacturing, beedi making and cracker factory, even salt making industry, where the labor is suffering from lots of health problems. No one can argue that globalization is a magic potion for every economy or every worker in the world, but it is clearly contributing to increased integration of labor market and closing the wage gap between workers in advanced and developing economies, especially through the spread of technology. But it also playing a part in increasing domestic income inequality. Labor protection organizations should lay emphasis on unorganized sector and employment to such laborer should be bound and protected by the laws and other rules and regulations so that should not be exploited by other. Nobel Prize winner Joseph Stiglitz, in his book Making Globalization Work, says the issue is not whether globalization itself is good or bad, but how we can reshape it to make it work better for the countries, for the people, and even for the poorest of the poor. Thank you.